I'm Alana,
And I'm Jesse.
and we are making menches. So, today, as part of our August series, the final episode in our series of having conversations with fellow anti Zionist Jews, we are talking to
Anna, but very close.
Anna. You did say that in the pronunciation, Anna Rajagopal.
Perfect. Yes.
Woo! I was so worried about pronouncing your name correctly, so I'm glad that we did that. Yeah, there's nothing else I can say. We're so excited to talk to Anna. This is truly so wonderful. Anna does incredible work. Can see we have some annoying people in the comments already, which is so fun. So yeah, with that, we'll pass it off to Anna to tell us just a brief overview of who they are, what your pronouns are, what you do, and like whatever that means for you. So, if you want to talk about what you do employment wise or what brings you joy, anything else you might want to share. And then we've been asking everyone, what is your favorite Jewish holiday and why?
Absolutely. Okay, so I'm Anna, obviously. My pronouns are they, she. What I do. I'm a full-time student at Rice University, waiting to hear back from an internship. A lot of the work that I do is writing, so I'm waiting to hear back from a magazine, so fingers crossed. My favorite Jewish holiday. Oh, that's a really hard question. I'm gonna have to say I like Tu B'Shvat. I'm
Yes.
a big Tu B'Shvat lover, but I think probably Rosh Hashanah because I think my childhood memories of Rosh Hashanah and like my mom like making the like round braided challah are like the most special to me. So but Hanukkah I can't pick. That's my final answer. I can't pick.
I love that you mentioned Tu B'Shvat first, though. That's definitely a personal fave, and I feel like I'm making mentions fave, so I'm always happy when people highlight Tu B'Shvat. Thank you, and thank you for being here. I think we'll just start out with what seems
Yeah.
like it might be a simple question to ground us a little bit.
Yeah. So we're curious, in whatever this means to you, what's your relationship to Judaism and how has it changed over time? That's a great question. I love that question. I think my relationship to Judaism is I think there's almost a binary relationship that I have to it. It's public facing and then private facing. And I think a lot of public facing Jewish figures are very aware of the level of scrutiny that they're under when it comes to Jewish identity and Jewish self. And then I also think there's a part of me that happens offline, like, celebrating Shabbat or, celebrating different Jewish holidays or, sitting Shiva, things like that. So those are like things that are personal that maybe I don't necessarily share all of the details of online. So I think that like my relationship to Judaism is shifting insofar as the public facing influences the private facing quite a bit. And I think that the level of scrutiny and dissection that public facing Jewishness kind of enables has shifted the ways in which I practice privately. So I guess I would describe my relationship to Judaism as ever changing, which can be good and can be bad, trying to find meaning in it. So, yeah.
Yeah, thank you. That makes a lot of sense, especially because you're someone who has a very public-facing platform and gets a lot of public-facing feedback. So I'm sure that the way that that intersects with your personal Judaism is very, very specific. Um, Sort of in tandem with that question, because I think it's pretty hard to disconnect the two, even though we would like to, is if you could talk about a little bit about your journey to anti-Zionism.
Absolutely. I think this is one of my greatest regrets, and I don't typically like to speak it into power, speak like, what do they say, truth into power. I don't like to talk about it necessarily so public facing unless it's in an explicitly Jewish space, because
Mm.
I think that talking about a past of or a previous history of Zionism often detracts from Palestinian realities and serves to
Mm.
center, Jewish feelings and Jewish journeys and that sort of thing. And I don't necessarily feel that that's productive insofar as like centering ourselves in someone else's struggle. But since this is like a Jewish space, I definitely think that my probably greatest shift was from Zionism to anti-Zionism. I think that indoctrination into Zionism was definitely something that I experienced as a child quite a bit. I remember, one time we had an IDF group
come to our school, and it was mandatory that we helped like learn how to carry a gurney and all this, just like horrific things that like, are ridiculous amount of propaganda. And so I think that shifting away from that indoctrination and into anti-Zionism has probably been the most significant radicalization I've experienced in such a positive way. And I think that that primarily came about through two people, one of whom is a Jew of color, a dear friend, who messaged me and, said, Anna, I'm really disappointed in you because, you're right on so much, but you're very wrong on this. And that, it hit hard. And she put me in contact with Aya Ghanameh, who is an incredible Palestinian organizer and artist and friend. And Aya and I had subsequently met in real life, which was fantastic. But Aya and I talked over WhatsApp, and I just kind of asked questions. And Aya very generously gave of me her time and energy and effort, which she didn't have to do because, I don't know if I would, talk to a fascist who is trying to reform themselves, right? But she did, and it completely shifted the way I viewed everything. It changed everything to me because she very, very vividly said, we still have Palestinians, we still have the keys to our homes that, people from New Jersey are living in, right? And I think for me, that was one of the moments where I was like, I'm a part of something horrific, and I need to, this is not doable in any sense. And I think Zionism is ultimately framed to Jewish audiences, especially Jewish young people and young Jews of color, as something positive. And oftentimes it's morphed into some strange social justice language. And I think that I was very misled, obviously taking full accountability and responsibility for the harm that I caused. But I was grateful and thankful and lucky enough to have really brave and really generous people who gave of me their time. So I guess that was how I came to anti-Zionism.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that with us. I've definitely seen you post about decentering sort of like the Jewish experience within Zionism to anti-Zionism because of the way that it detracts from Palestinian reality. And that's something that actually really stuck with me when you posted about that. I was like, this is a great point. Because I think it's hard to be involved in Jewish American spaces without talking about your relationship to Zionism, or in our case, anti-Zionism.
Absolutely. And I think also like it's necessary in Jewish spaces to talk about it, because otherwise, specifically within Jewish spaces, we're not going to experience the shift that we should. So
yeah, thank you for that. That is just really important for us to reflect on.
Yeah, and I think there's so much to unpack in what you gave as an answer to that. So I'm not really doing it justice by asking this as a follow-up question, but we have somewhat of an idea based on what you've posted about your experience in the Jewish community as a Jewish convert of color and how that has kind of informed your experience around anti-Zionism, but also just around Judaism and being in Jewish spaces. And would you want to expand? You could start with just Jewish spaces in general and being a person of color and how that has been, or speaking more broadly and just the world as a Jewish person of color, and then also with what you've been going through. However you'd like to start.
Absolutely. I think being a Jewish person of color is, it's a beautiful thing. Obviously, it's who I am, it's my identity. But I think because of the ways that Jewish institutional and communal life are structured, that it makes occupying that identity very difficult at times. And I think that, it's been hard to find grounded IRL, like in real life community because of it, because we'll go into I'm in a mixed race family, and we'll go into a synagogue and, get looks or questions as to why we're there. And that's a very difficult experience to have because, you're coming to a Shabbat service to feel welcome, and instead you're feeling ostracized or like you don't belong. And I think that historically has been my and my family's experience within, real life Jewish spaces, or kind of just outright kind of racism and outright kind of, heterosis patriarchy and outright white supremacy and things like that. And I think, I haven't talked about this very much, just because it is being investigated by the National Postal Service, but some white Zionists sent cockroaches to my house last summer, where my family lives, where my younger sibling who's a minor lives, with racial slurs written on the outside. And so it's been very difficult. It's been really difficult to the point of physical violence. And I think that has definitely been heightened as a result of actively challenging the systems that maintain Zionism, maintain supremacy, maintain heterosis patriarchy, maintain all of these different things. And I think that, a lot of Jewish communal spaces are welcoming as long as you're quiet, and as long as you decide to be the token, as long as you are a body and not a voice. And I think that and already, people who don't say anything experience violence. But then I think going into your question about anti-Zionism, when you're vocal about these things, I think that it definitely puts Jews of color under far more scrutiny than white Jews. Myself and, my Black, Indigenous, other South Asians, just all my, close friends and comrades and organizers who are also Jews of color have experienced just an untold amount of physical, emotional, psychological trauma as a result of being vocally anti-Zionist in Jewish, overwhelmingly white Jewish spaces. And I think that, Jewish people of color retain systemic power over Palestinians, and at the same time experience oppression from, white, Ashkenormative, Zionist power structures. And so I think we straddle this kind of balance where it is necessary for us to be vocal about the oppression that we experience and the oppression that Palestinians experience as well. And it does, unfortunately, I think, cause quite a bit of, just violence in general. And so that's, been very difficult just on a physical level too, to navigate. I think we don't often talk about how much it weighs on the body, which, I think it's catching up with me, or it's caught up with me. But yeah, that was a long answer to a short question. My apologies.
No, don't apologize. So important. And thank you for sharing that with us and just acknowledging that, you're coming into a space that is two white Jews who are asking you questions about things that we have not had to experience. So thank you for feeling comfortable enough to share those really painful and horrific experiences with us. And yeah, just obviously I wish things were so different, because I can't imagine the way that you've had to internalize all of the backlash that you receive, especially when it's coming from a community that is supposed to be a home and a community. I feel like that's a lot more draining. A lot of your activism on social media is centered around anti-imperialism and anti-colonialism, and you mentioned that in a few of your responses. So how do you feel like the framework of anti-imperialism and anti-colonialism supports anti-Zionism? How does anti-Zionism fit into those frameworks?
Absolutely. I think that anti-Zionism is fundamentally, anti-imperialism and anti-colonialism, okay, brain hurting. I'm not even gonna try. Because I think that, that relies on the framework of understanding that Zionism is a colonial ideology, and that it is a fascist ideology, and that it is an imperial ideology, and that it is inherently violent. And so anything that opposes it would thus then be anti-imperialism and anti-colonialism. And so I think that, the very same structures that are embedded within Zionism, we've seen historically in so many other instances of colonial empires taking root and displacing and, brutally hurting indigenous populations. The same, types of behaviors, the same actions, the same justifications. It's a historic pattern. And I think, Zionists are very well aware of this because they're using textbook, tools that imperialists have used for such a long time. Whether we're looking at India or whether we're looking at Haiti, it doesn't necessarily matter, because it all is the same insofar as it's imperialism, which is another reason why I think that the Palestinian struggle for freedom is so important to so many people, because all of our struggles are interconnected. And any group of people who has struggled with imperialism or the violence of imperialism should be aligned with Palestine and should be aligned with the work that Palestinians are doing all the time. And so I think, acknowledging that level of solidarity and how deep those networks of organizing run should really show us the ways in which anti-Zionism is connected to anti-imperialism.
Yeah, thank you so much for that. I feel like something that comes up for me a lot is, interacting with fellow, radical or leftist people, especially those who are Jewish, who would identify as anti-imperialist or anti-colonial, but then being Zionist or supporting Israel.
That's a thing.
And I feel like that, and like, I feel like I've been there, like that I was once there, and I had to step back and be like, this cannot align at all. These can't exist at the same time.
Yeah, and I think it's because Zionists are really in recent years have picked up social justice language and have started to use it as a way to manipulate young people who are otherwise left-leaning or liberal-leaning and kind of manipulate the kind of verbal geography and the digital footprint of Zionism in a way that, kind of not necessarily, I'm not trying to say that Zionists aren't very aware of what they're doing, but it definitely misconstrues what Zionism is, because, you see like a lot of very prominent Zionists say things like Zionism is an indigenous rights movement, or, free Palestine, like what about indigenous Jews are indigenous, all these, there are a lot of aspects of, language that is like a response to colonialism that Zionists are co-opting and appropriating as a means to an end. And it's very obvious and it's very see-through because it doesn't work. I mean, it's a wolf in sheep's clothing. And I think even when corrected, even when Zionists are told that the word indigenous is defined by your relationship to settler colonialism, they don't listen. And I think all of their arguments fall apart, and they've got like 4 of them in total. And so I think that, but I do think that it's a real trap. It's a real trap in Jewish life for young people. And I think that it's something that should be talked about more and identified more, because you have these really big Instagram accounts. And I was once, I was probably 18 when I found these accounts, but these really big Instagram accounts that, they orientalize themselves, right? They try to make themselves look, quote unquote, like Middle Eastern, so to speak. They try to make themselves look friendly to people of color, Jews of color, things like that. They talk about Jews of color quite a bit. And then they also intersperse Israeli like propaganda throughout. And I think that those accounts are very much, part of this kind of Hasbara propaganda machine that like manipulates the language of people of color, of indigenous people, of Black people, language that's found in like very specific spaces and used for very specific reasons. And they just kind of, use that language to capture an audience. And, reinforce that Zionism is the right thing rather than the wrong thing. And I think it's important to counteract that language and that messaging. Anyway, that was a rant. Sorry.
No, I mean, that's what we're here for. We love a rant. And we're just here to chat. But yeah, I mean, I think that's so, so important, and like so much of what makes Zionist propaganda so effective, especially in like the digital age. And especially in an age when so many young people are becoming more radical because of what they're able to learn online. I don't know, I feel like I had less interaction with radical spaces in an online sense when I was growing up, and I didn't really get into like online radical spaces until I was probably already an anti-Zionist and I'd already made the shift. But I'm really curious what my experience would have been like interacting with, accounts in the way that accounts know. Yeah, like people know how to make things appealing. People know how to make a good graphic and use the right language that compels people, especially a young person who might feel, already alienated in their Judaism, and then to latch on and be like, oh, okay, well, people are taking this land from me and my people. And yeah, feeding into those very like social justice themes and ideology. But right, all of that is coming from a rich history of actual like radical anti-imperialist, anti-colonial work that has been done by indigenous folks, Black folks, other folks of color. And I always just think about like Angela Davis, and I was someone who was so invested in Angela Davis and her work. And then I read Freedom is a Constant Struggle, and the way that she like links the Palestinian struggle to all struggles for liberation, I think was really important for me, and to think about the idea that like we can't be fighting for liberation if that does not include Palestinian liberation. Like that is the crux of our present day struggle for liberation and freedom and like
Yeah.
pursuit of justice.
No, I agree. And I also think that it's really important to identify these behaviors as grooming. I think that a lot of older Zionists who are very well established will utilize this language and cultivate special relationships with young Jews, specifically young Jews of color online, who, yes, you're right, are seeking community. And I think that the behavior is very predatory. And I think that it's textbook groomer behavior. And I think that it's typical of most cults, most extreme right-wing fascist groups. I think that this behavior, we've seen it over and over again. You know, like name a cult, that's what they've done. And so I think that recognizing the patterns, protecting our youth, making sure that like young Jews, especially young Jews of color, are exposed to anti-Zionism, are exposed to radical community care and responsibility, are exposed to mutual aid, are exposed to the things that, you know, really drive organizing and really drive a sense of community is important. And I think the earlier we do it, the better, because Zionists latch on really young. Zionist indoctrination began, I mean, Jewish preschools will sing, you know, the Israeli Independence Day anthem, right? So I think being sure that, you know, I don't know, that's something that I'm always very conscious of, is the way that I look in a public facing manner to young Jews of color, and making sure that, like, you know, because if I had been 17 going on 18 and exposed to, you know, the Jews of color who are in my life right now, who are anti-Zionist versus the Zionists that I was exposed to, I think my trajectory and journey to anti-Zionism would have looked a whole lot different. I think it would have been less harmful. I think it would have been healthier for everyone. And so I think that it's really, I just really can't underscore enough the level of abuse that happens within Jewish communities to young people, involving Zionism and involving power structures of whiteness. But yeah, no, I agree with everything that you said. But yeah.
Thank you for
Wow.
highlighting that.
Yeah, you just blew my mind with the like grooming behavior, being, and the comparison, right? Because to the comparison is like a sexual assault or a violation, right, in some sense. And I think there are a lot of young people who feel that something is off and they can't explain why, and they're just kind of bullied into
Exactly. And I remember that there was this large Zionist account when I was like really, really like trying to explore what it means to be a Jewish person of color. I really didn't know what it meant. I just started posting about it and wondering and being curious. And this really big Jewish account now, it has some crazy amount of followers, and it's a huge like account that like propagates Israeli propaganda, but also, you know, does a spiel for young Jews of color. But this account decided to start calling itself, you know, my mother personally in DMs. And I was like 17, 18 maybe. Or, you know, this account started posting like, you know, Anna's like my now adoptive digital daughter and things like that, in an effort to push Zionism very, very hard. And, you know, other things. Like I remember when I was transitioning out of Zionism and transitioning more into anti-Zionism, some of the three largest Zionist propaganda accounts, who are huge now, who have published books and written articles, messaged me and asked for a three-way call. They're all adults. I was maybe 20, 19, and they're all in their like late 30s, and they said, we want to get on a three-way call with you and remind you, you know, of what we've done for you, and remind you of what Zionism really means. I think that level of abuse is what's going on in our communities. And I haven't talked about it because anytime I try to talk about it, they come after me and other young Jews of color. But I've talked to other young Jews of color, specifically femmes, non-binary people, and women, and they're having the exact same experiences with large Zionist influencers and leaders and things like that, the same types of behaviors. And I've done my best to say, you know, I experienced this. You need to get out. If you need support, and they've said straight up, I've been told, she's the only person I know who is a Jew of color who has resources. That's what I've been told, because these accounts manipulate history and manipulate resources and manipulate all these things so that they seem like the only way that you can connect as a young Jew of color to your Jewishness. And I don't think that that's true. And I think part of radicalizing Jewish spaces is unveiling a lot of history that isn't talked about, like the kidnapping of Yemeni Jewish children in Israel, or the way that the Black Panthers in Israel worked alongside Palestinians. There's so much Jewish history that's rich with, either the same oppressive behaviors or rich with the ways that Jews of color have worked alongside abolition and anarchist movements. Yemenite, my apologies. And I think that exposure to those things and real history rather than Zionist propaganda is something that we should be teaching. And it's a giant, massive bummer that it's not taught. But yeah, there's so much Jewish history that I don't know that I'd like to know. But every time I Google something or something comes up on the internet, it's like full of Zionist propaganda. And I'm like, I can't read this. But yeah.
Yeah, I think that's so real. I mean, and that's why it can feel so hard to break out of that, because like just simply finding information is so difficult unless you have someone who can like provide it to you or like point you in the right direction. And I'm so grateful for people who have provided me with those resources and who have made that clear, and accounts like your own that like continually actually provide me with real time information on how to be a better anti-Zionist Jew and how to support Palestinian liberation as an anti-Zionist Jew, because it's not there if people like you are not doing it. And that's like a really massive burden to have to take on, to be like, okay, well, no one else is doing this, so I have to be disseminating this information. So yeah, you and accounts like yours are so impactful for that. And it's just really scary to hear the grooming tactics that like older people are using on people who are like children, like literal children. Because yeah, those can be super impactful, especially if it's people that you look up to and already admire and like want to please and want them to be proud of you or feel like you need to be a part of that space to be Jewish.
Exactly. Thank you for vocalizing that. I agree wholeheartedly.
Oh, okay, so switching gears a little bit, not that far, of course, though. Prefacing this with, please share as much that you are comfortable with sharing and no more, and don't feel pressure to answer anything that does not feel appropriate or sensitive to what you're going through. Recently, Avodah fired you for your anti-Zionist activism, and we cannot imagine how difficult this time has been for you. Even though I have been through a firing, I have not experienced anything similar to what you have experienced. So how have you been dealing with the backlash from the Jewish community, and have you found supportive anti-Zionist Jewish community, or anything else you'd like to share on this topic?
I think that this has probably been the most difficult Jewish experience of my life. I think that the physical impact was probably the most traumatic for me because it all happened so fast. And as it was happening, real life people were harassing me as well about it. The local Hillel was engaging in a level of inappropriate contact with me that I was uncomfortable with. So just to kind of give a better context, it was both digital and in person. And I think that my body went into shutdown mode. I threw up probably 5 or 6 times, couldn't stop shaking. I ran a fever. I couldn't drive for probably 4 days, 5 days. I just was very physically ill, and I was very anxious, like all the time. I couldn't sit still. Everything was shaking. I felt dizzy. I felt lightheaded. It was just an extended panic attack for quite some time because, normally when something bad happens, it ends. But this did not end, and it still has not ended. And so I think it was just a continual level of physical trauma that, really messed me up. I lost a bit of weight. I was not eating. I couldn't keep anything down. I went to an urgent care center to try to figure out what was wrong. And it was just an extended panic attack. And so I think that level of like physicality and like throwing up was really difficult for me, and just being physically incapacitated while all of this was happening. And also while everyone was expecting a lot out of me, like everyone was expecting me to talk and I could not hold my phone straight. I think that was really hard for me. I think that the way that all of it went down, the level of speed that it happened with was jarring. And so I think there was a level of shock that happened because, you know, you get one or two hateful comments on the internet, you can brush it off, right? But when you get 10,000, when you get your home address sent to you, when you get pictures of your parents' faces and their emails and their workplaces linked on a mass watchdog organization's website, when people are sending you, you know, very sexually explicit messages, when people are emailing your parents very sexually explicit messages about you, fantasies about you, it's a very terrifying level of racialization and kind of hypersexualization that turned into something brutally violent. And I think that I hadn't ever experienced anything to that extent of violence in terms of like from the Jewish community. And I think that it definitely has majorly shifted the way I view the anti-Zionist Jewish community, not the Zionist community, because I expect this from Zionists, right? Like I expect the absolute most subhuman, you know, poo-poo level behavior from these people. But from the anti-Zionist Jewish community, I think is where I was universally the most disappointed. Because while, yes, there was an outpouring of support that I will always be grateful for, while a lot of people put a lot on the line to say something for me, specifically Jews of color, a lot of so-called anti-Zionists didn't end up being anti-Zionism when rubber hit the road. And so a lot of personal conversations over text, DM, and phone call turned into a lot of quote unquote anti-Zionists, some of whom are very famous, verified anti-Zionists on Twitter and Instagram, support Avodah's decision in many ways, advocate for the people at Avodah, tell me that I'm being unfair and cruel in my response. And so I think that my disappointment has been in the anti-Zionist Jewish community, just because I know that we can do better. And the crux of this issue isn't the harassment that I experienced. The crux of the issue is that Avodah, as a social justice organization, hiring me for an anti-racist position, chose Israel and Zionism and white supremacy. But they made a decision. They had a non-stance policy. Obviously, non-stance is a stance, but they reaffirmed that stance of siding with Zionism when they fired me in their subsequent engagement with Zionists. They emailed Zionists. Cheryl Cook, who's the CEO, emailed Zionists and told them that I had been fired. She was like, you know, rest assured, you know, kind of like a don't worry, we took care of it. And so I think that level of, you know, collaboration with known and violent members of Zionism really puts Avodah in the spotlight in a very interesting way. And I think more than that, since it's happened, a lot of folks have come forward to me with experiences with Avodah and told me that, you know, they've experienced classism. A lot of Jewish folks have experienced deep, deep classism from Avodah because you have to raise the money for an Avodah position before you even go into it. And, you know, a poor person, working class person came to me and said Avodah was harassing them about not raising enough money. But how can you raise money when you're from a poor community and no one has money to give? You know, I've heard from other people who had gone through the program that they're not ADA compliant, that they don't help people with disabilities. I've heard that the working conditions are abusive. And the fact that ultimately the role that I was hired for was fundamentally a way to fix the lack of engagement that Jews of color had with Avodah, I think that's very telling. I think if you ask around enough Jews of color, you'll get a consensus, and that is that Avodah does not cater to Jews of color, because I always, you know, I wonder, because I was hired specifically to do advocacy for the JOC, the Jew of Color Bayit program, which is like it's like the Bayit program where you go and you live in a specific city and do social justice work. but they had one for Jews of color exclusively. And I was hired to promote that role. And so I wonder why, when Jews of color came forward and said that in the generalized Bayit program, they were experiencing racism, that Avoda's solution was, instead of to actively fight, combat, and acknowledge and turn over the racism that was happening, their solution was to segregate. You know, it's a different story if Jews of color actively decide that we need our own space, but to be put aside by an organization and told that your problems are solved by staying away is a whole nother issue. And so I think that a lot of the logic behind the decision to fire me and to stand with Zionism is also rooted in fundamental racism and in the very same structures of power that are hurting marginalized people within the program. And so I think that this has also kind of opened my eyes with regard to nonprofit Jewish work. Kind of wondering who's in charge here. What are they doing? Why is a white person in charge of Jews of color? Why is an all-white staff taking Juneteenth off and not doing any sort of reparation work? Why is Avodah canceled on that Monday when there's no upper staff that's, you know, Black? Why? And so I think all of these problems are connected to the same fundamental issue, and that's white supremacy, that's Zionism, that's structures of power that Avodah is not afraid to abandon and that they actively want to cleave to for survival. And it's not an Avodah issue solely. A lot of Jewish organizations that profess to be in favor of social justice are merely upholding a norm. And if you press them hard enough, they fall apart, and behind them are donors who also fund AIPAC, donors who also fund Birthright, donors who actively engage with organizations like Canary Mission, Stop Anti-Semitism, Hillel, etc., the ADL, whatever, give or take. So I think that it's a revealing experience, if anything, and I think that a lot of things came to light that we shouldn't ignore, so far as, you know, the way that people in our community kind of couple when pressed about Zionism and anti-Zionism. And I think that Palestinians are consistently de-centered in conversations in Jewish spaces about social justice, because you fundamentally cannot have a conversation in Jewish spaces about social justice if you're not centering Palestinians, because our, you know, entire institutional and communal life is rooted fundamentally in the West in the continual oppression of Palestinian people. And so I think Avodah, you know, that's a Zionism issue. Avodah is Zionist. And I think that, you know, if you're a Jew of color or an anti-Zionist Jewish person or an anarchist Jewish person who wants to spend a year working with a supposedly social justice org, that decision should be reevaluated, and that maybe time would be better spent investing in local community and investing in grassroots organization, investing in SJP wherever you are, investing in, you know, working towards building better coalitions with oppressed and marginalized people, specifically Palestinians, because at the end of the day, it's exploitation of labor, and it's exploitation of labor for a Zionist organization. And I think that that's important to note. But yeah.
Yeah, literally, I wish I could package up everything you said and put a little bow on it. I just think it's like so important, especially when we're talking about, yeah, nonprofits, especially Western nonprofits, I think can often frame themselves as being a certain way, but beneath the surface that time and time again is proven to not be the case. And like we talked on the Not Your Bubby's Torah School episode kind of a while ago now, like maybe 6 months ago, about a similar experience that my friend who was a Black woman had in a Jewish nonprofit space that she went into, being like, I'm so excited for this, and this is going to be like such a wonderful experience. And then it was maybe like the worst experience of her life. And like the clear levels of racism and just discrimination that she experienced in that Jewish nonprofit that claims to be so like progressive and supportive were, I mean, I wish I could say it was more surprising or disappointing, but truly like nonprofits are no different than the rest of the imperialist machine that we live under. So I appreciate your point about talking about investing our time in local community and building coalition and focusing on mutual aid, because truly, like, that's where we're actually going to be able to make a difference. This is why community building is so essential, because we're not going to be able to make the changes we want to see by engaging in the system in that way. Especially when those nonprofits are entirely white, which most of the time they are.
They are. And then it's like, I went to the staff meeting and I looked around and I'm like, why is my face and one other face the only ethnic ones in this room? And why are you talking, Cheryl Cook, about, you know, marginalization when the most marginalization you experience is, you know, that of being a woman or that of being a Jewish person, which everyone in this room also experiences. So I think that, like, the fact, you know, and I had an interview the other day with a publishing house that specifically, quote unquote, publishes underrepresented voices, right? And I was coming in as an unpaid intern, and I was sitting in the interview, my first interview, and the white Jewish woman, you know, I mentioned that I was Jewish briefly, and the white Jewish woman said, "Oh my God, you're Jewish?" And I was like, "Yeah." And she was like, "Oh my God, I've never like met one of you people." And I was like, "One of you? Like, what does that mean?" She goes, "Yeah, I've never seen one of you guys. Like, I've heard about like Jews from like India, but like I've never like actually met one of you. And I've seen you like on the internet." I'm like, I'm sitting here and I'm like, oh my God. So I left that interview and I made an appointment with her boss, who ran the quote unquote diversity publishing house. And I said, "I can't work for you." She's white too. I said to these two white women, "I can't work for you. You're trying to represent quote unquote underrepresented voices, but as soon as you hire an intern of color, you're sitting here calling me you people." And she was like, "You know, I'm so sorry. Like, our mission statement, like, that breaks my heart, because like our mission statement is to represent like your voice." And I'm like, first of all, not a charity case. Second of all, like, all of these orgs that pretend to be for social justice are usually run by white folk. And if they're not run by white people, the backing is, you know, the donors, the boards, all of these things, they're predominantly white. And I think that that's a problem, because I don't understand. Like, I get allyship and I understand the concept of that, but it's also like, you can't, like, I don't know, your voice isn't going to be supposed to be the loudest one in the room, and it's certainly not supposed to be calling me you people. But I think, and that was I should have stepped away from Avodah. I shouldn't have taken the position in the first place, honestly, because some Palestinians approached me about this and said, you really shouldn't have taken it, because a non-stance is a stance, and you know that. And if you look through the website and you look at the donors, it's very easy to tell. And I was like, you know what, you're right, and that's my fault. I shouldn't have even taken the position, because that, I mean, I should have done my due diligence and understood that I thought that a non-stance was progressive for a Jewish organization. But the reality is that we have to expect more, and we have to expect better, and that we cannot settle. And that level of violence I experienced because I made the decision to work for a Zionist organization. And for this interview that I had for the publishing house, I just said no. I was like, I'm not making the same mistake again. You are racist, and I'm stepping away. Thank you for the consideration, but this is not the right fit. I would prefer to work for a person of color. And I just left the Zoom interview. And so I think that, like, actively making decisions to step away from oppressive organizations, whether they be nonprofit or giant companies, is what we need to do. And I think that, you know, we've lost a lot of Jewish activists, quote unquote, anti-Zionist Jewish activists, to the ADL, to other Zionist organizations. And that's a level of character that's been compromised. And, you know, we can't do that. We can't settle, because if you're, and that's, you know, essentially what this has, I don't want to say taught me, because I sound like a bozo, but I think that, like, we have to understand that, like, money and a job and all of these, like, you can't compromise your character for your livelihood. That's not how it works. Like, solidarity can't just extend to the dollar bill and stop. Like, I think that that's, like, something that is really now important to me, is I'm not going to be taking positions to the best of my ability and to the best of my snooping that are at all involved or invested in racism or Zionism or any form of, which are synonyms, or any form of supremacy, unless it's, like, you know, people of color are cool supremacy. Because I think that, like, you know, that level of, and then that's another reason that I had so much trouble with Avodah and the response from the anti-Zionist Jewish community. Because so many people in the anti-Zionist Jewish community compromised their allyship with Palestinians by agreeing with Avodah or by not having a stance. And to me, that tells me that you're a Zionist. And the same thing happened recently. I tweeted something like, sorry, but because I saw a bunch of Zionists interacting with anti-Zionists on Twitter, and I was like, that's not okay, because the TL and the algorithm bring that into Palestinian spaces, and a lot of us have mutuals who are Palestinians, and that puts them in a level of danger because maybe they're on Prive and they're tweeting personal details, and that puts them in a level of danger that's not okay. So I tweeted something like, you can't be friends with Zionists because that makes you a Zionist, and it made a lot of people angry. It made a lot of quote unquote anti-Zionists angry. And I'm sitting here and I'm thinking, how can you call yourself an anti-Zionist if your friends are fascists? Like, I don't, like, bro, like, I'm not going to be friends with Nazis because that doesn't look so good for me. And so thank you. I'm thinking, like, and a Palestinian woman pressed one of these anti-Zionists and said, why are you friends with Zionists? And he said, if you don't like my anti-Zionism, go away. It's not for you. And she's Palestinian. And she said, well, if it's not for me, then who's it for? And at the end of the day, I think that a lot of like so-called anti-Zionists, their anti-Zionism is not for Palestinians or for allyship with Palestine. It's for internet clout. It's for self-serving, pretentiousness on Twitter. It's for, creating quote unquote radical Jewish spaces that aren't actually radical, but just like a bunch of your friends who are secretly Zionists and get to pal around in DMs. And I think that like, Avodah, I think that like, these Twitter incidents, I think that there are a lot of things that are happening right now and that will continue happening that we need to keep an eye on. And I think we need to notice the people and the organizations who are saying certain things or not saying certain things, and make sure that we're organizing with people we trust, with people we know, with people who have a history and a track record that's consistent and that's admirable and that's in solidarity. And I think that for me, the Avodah thing really just revealed a bunch of people who I was like, nope, you are not someone who I feel comfortable sharing personal details with or including in spaces that I also simultaneously share with Palestinians. And so that was a really long rant and I got loud. So sorry again, but.
No, that's.
I don't apologize at all.
What we're here for.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I think that point, if you phrased that in relation to any other form of oppression, people would be like, yeah, of course. Like if you said you're homophobic, if you're friends with homophobes, people would be like, yeah, like I would never be friends with a homophobe, or like, people wouldn't bring someone who is actively homophobic around their friends who are queer.
Yeah, exactly.
But then all of a sudden it gets like more complex or more complicated when that's in quotes if you're listening to us on the podcast, when we're talking about Zionism and the way that, constantly having to have your feed inundated with conversations about like debating your humanity feels for Palestinian people on the internet. And if like you're claiming to have this space that is supposed to be liberatory and like safe and not harmful for Palestinian folks, then what does it mean for you to bring Zionists who are going to be actively harmful and challenging Palestinian humanity into that space?
And I think also, what does it mean for you as a person? Like, what does that, because if I were doing that, I feel real bad about myself, and I take a minute and I take a breather and I think, okay, well, how are my actions not lining up with the ideology that I profess to have? Because at the end of the day, you can spout that you're an anti-Zionist Jewish person online all you want, but if you're not actively engaging with mutual aid, if you're not actively centering Palestinian voices, if you're not actively making sure that the people that you share space with are kept safe, housed, fed, transported where they need to go, then I think that a lot of it is lip service. And I think that we need to put our foot down in our communities and in our spaces with regard to what flies. Because what we do determines how our spaces look. And I don't want to be in a space where someone, is who doesn't believe in another person's humanity, because that makes me feel unsafe and uncomfortable. And that makes, a Palestinian person or a Black person or an Indigenous person or another person of color feel unsafe and uncomfortable. And we would never ask, as Jewish people, other Jewish people to occupy spaces with neo-Nazis. We would never ask that. right? We would, like you said, we would never ask queer people to occupy spaces with homophobes. We would never ask, you know, disabled people to occupy spaces with people who are violently ableist, because that would be a level of violence that is not fair or right in any way. And I think that the double standard is one we often see with Israel in so many ways, and with Zionism, that double standard being leveraged, because, you know, the idea is that because Jewish people occupy a marginalized identity in much of the globe, that like we can't perpetuate harm in, you know, any other way. And I think that that is something that needs to be dispelled immediately, especially within Jewish spaces, because it leads to so much harm. But yeah, no, I completely agree with what you said.
Yeah, thank you so much for that. Earlier in your answer to that question, you mentioned Stop Anti-Zionism, which is a right-wing Jewish group.
Oh, stop anti-Semitism?
Yeah,
Stop
anti-Semitism.
Yeah.
We don't want to stop anti-Zionism.
No, we want to keep that going. We really want to keep that pushing. Yeah, it's just Stop Anti-Semitism. My brain is just like anti-Zionism.
No, I know.
I feel that. And obviously, Stop Anti-Semitism publicly spoke out against you following your firing from Avodah. And so I'm just curious, like, because obviously, like, groups like Stop Anti-Semitism cause so much harm to Jewish activists and anti-Zionist activists in general. But I'm curious, where was I going with this question? Right, I guess I'm curious how we can engage with those things when they happen. And like, yeah, I mean, it doesn't feel beneficial to ask you about the harm that they cause, because it is so apparent and you've gone into it in depth already. But just how can other anti-Zionist Jews engage and step up to the plate when things like this are happening?
I mean, yeah, Stop Anti-Semitism was the impetus and the catalyst for my firing. And I think that, you know, they are very well funded. Lior Rez is very well connected, and that the people who fund Stop Anti-Semitism are also very heavily involved with the ADL and with AIPAC and other major donors and companies. It is a network of Zionism. And I think that might feel daunting. You know, it might feel daunting for anti-Zionist Jews to speak up when these things happen. It might feel scary. It might feel like, you know, you might get doxxed next. But I think that when we're talking about inter-community dynamics, it's really important to notice who is getting doxxed and who is getting hurt. You know, sometimes we'll have someone like Eli Valley, who's a white man, get doxxed, right? Very rarely. But most of the time, it's people like me, or it's people like Rebecca Pierce, right? It's Jews of color. And I think that identifying that inter-community dynamic and the level of power that white anti-Zionist Jews have, they're not going to go after you. That's the thing, they're not going to do it, because when you go after white people, there's consequences for your actions. So I think that leveraging that power and leveraging the ability to navigate life with very little consequence racially is something that needs to be done. And I think that fear of speaking out is something that needs to kind of be worked through on a personal level, and like asking yourself, why am I afraid? What is causing this fear? And understanding that fear is rooted fundamentally in the oppression of people of color. And I think that, like, you know, making sure that you're publicly speaking out, because the reality is when these watchdog groups put us on their lists, when you Google our names, they pay so that the top search is their smear campaign. So like when an employer Googles my name now, the top search for as long as these people have money is going to be Stop Anti-Semitism, right? The top search on Twitter, on Instagram, on whatever platform, every platform that they put me on is going to be that, linking my parents' information, linking my information, linking emails, linking workplaces, linking where I live, those sorts of things. And so to counterbalance that level of digital violence, there needs to be a public-facing support. Because if I'm an employer and I'm Googling your name, I can see either a crazy right-wing group that a lot of people are saying is bad, or I see an organization that's calling an anti-Zionist and anti-Semite and not knowing much about it. I think, maybe they're right. And so I think if you're an anti-Zionist Jew, your voice holds a lot of power. And if an employer or a work colleague or a friend or a partner sees anti-Zionist Jews saying no, this is messed up, this is wrong, that creates a dynamic, that creates a level of consistency that we need. And I think that while Jews of color are targeted, it's important to identify that the primary people who are impacted by this violence are Palestinians, and that these organizations would not exist if it weren't for Zionism. And that at the end of the day, yes, they're going to come after us as like people of color who are also allies, but the first people they're going to come after, that they always have come after, are Palestinians who lose their jobs, lose their livelihoods, God forbid, experience physical violence, lose their family. And so I think also, even more so, speaking out publicly needs to happen when Palestinians are being targeted, which is most of the time. And I think not just speaking out publicly, but helping to organize email campaigns. That's been done in past. I remember when Yasmin was doxxed by Canary Mission, and we organized an email campaign to one of the UC schools, working on mutual aid, getting people fed and housed. When I lost my job, I was counting on that money for groceries over the summer. I was counting on that money for, I don't know, just a whole lot of things, rent. I just moved into a new apartment. I was counting on that money to help me with a lot of avenues of my life, because money is not trivial, right? And so organizing ways that community members can be supported when these things happen, because losing your job is not a trivial thing, right? Because when you take a job, you turn down a lot. I turned down a lot of other stuff so that I could take that job at Abuda, right? Paying gigs that could have lasted through the summer, and I could have made a significant amount of money, right? And so I think that making sure that people are getting the food and the rent and the relaxation, all of the elements, entertainment, all of the things that it takes to be a well-rounded human being, that they would have gotten from the pay of that job, that they're getting now. So definitely mutual aid. I also just think support. I got a lot of messages that I still haven't responded to because I don't have the emotional depth right now to be able to do that, or the emotional wherewithal. But sending like supportive messages, I think, is something that really helped me, and knowing that people are, and not just privately, like people who only messaged privately but didn't say anything publicly, made me feel a little bit upset and unsupported. But if you're also speaking out publicly, why not also send a private message and just say that you're there? Give like some contact info or something like that. Reach out. And another thing is, if you have connections in media, if you have connections in press, if you have an organization, even if it's tiny, and you're willing to platform a voice, that media, something that an attorney I spoke with at Palestine Legal said to me is that any good media is an appropriate response to bad media. Any good media you can get is an appropriate response. So interviews, podcasts, whatever, you name it, connections that you have, mine those connections for people who are struggling and give them those connections. People reached out to me with contact for different reporters and different organizations who might be able to help. I think giving that information is important. So I think that there's a lot that can be done that isn't necessarily done, because it's hard to think of protocol for it, because things like this shouldn't happen. We shouldn't have a protocol for it, but there has to be one in place. Because I think that these things are very traumatic on so many levels, to the person and to their family and to their friends and to everyone who's in their lives. And so I think that like establishing that protocol is extremely important in continuing to damage the credibility of these groups. We need to damage the credibility of Stop Anti-Semitism and Canary Mission until they're seen as what they are, which are extreme right-wing hate groups that support Zionism at the end of the day. And until these groups are non-existent or are laughed at, and until employers don't cave to what these groups want, we have to keep doing what we're doing and exposing them. And we have to fight them. And that's, whether that looks like buying the domain. I think someone's trying to buy the domain name off Stop Anti-Semitism right now.
Oh yeah.
Whether that's happening, whether, it's exposing the donors behind Canary Mission publicly, because they do the best they can to stay hidden. Anything that can be done to reveal what's behind the curtain, to take from them, to steal anything and everything that gives them power, is important, because really they're just big bullies. And I think that it's important to give the bully a taste of their own medicine and take away any power that they have. And so I guess that would be my advice. Again, I'm not Palestinian, so I can't speak from the perspective of someone who is like truly disenfranchised at that level, and what is the course of action for that case. But like, as like someone who is a Jewish like femme of color, like that is kind of where I see things helping.
Thank you so much for taking the time and like the energy and passion that you bring to this conversation, which like you just said, you don't have energy to like spare on this, you know, at this time, especially with everything you're going through. So I really appreciate like the work that it takes to show up to this conversation. I think
Thank
it should
you.
be noted that like, yes, interviews in good press and that sounds amazing, but also it's a lot of work on you and
Yeah.
talk about unpaid labor, you know? And once again, like teaching white anti-Zionist Jews about your experience is labor, like and teaching us how to respond better to situations is labor. So I think that's something that is not addressed at all. I am conscious of time and I am curious if before we wrap up, you would like to share one myth you want to dispel about anti-Zionism or slash and one affirmation you'd like to leave fellow Jewish anti-Zionists with?
I think one myth that I wanted to spell about like anti-Zionism in Jewish spaces is that you can't be an anti-Zionist and have meaningful connection to Jewish life or community. I think that's like bupkis. I think that that's enforced by Zionists to make sure that you are anti-Zionist. I have found the most meaningful connections of my Jewish life to come out of anti-Zionism, to come out of coalitions built in and around anti-Zionism, even if not from Jewish people. I, have been organizing a lot locally with, University of Houston Students for Justice Palestine, and the connections that I've made in the people who have looked out for me when things are bad in ways that I would say nourish my Jewish life are incredible. And so I think that like the connections that I've made through anti-Zionism have kept me fed in a lot of ways, in both the physical sense and also in the spiritual sense. And so, and I also think that it expands my Jewish knowledge and my Jewish self and my desire to learn about Judaism, Jewishness, and disassociate Jewishness from, and disassociate Jewishness in terms of like my identity from, Zionism explicitly. And that's something really beautiful that I think is that we need to dispel that myth and make sure that people are aware that you can be a very happy Jewish anti-Zionist in community with other Jewish anti-Zionists or non-Jewish anti-Zionists. And I guess one affirmation, that's also an affirmation, but I think an affirmation I have is like also a piece of advice is organize locally. I think digital activism is really important and really essential, especially if you're disabled, and that's valid and real. Because sometimes I can't get out of bed. Sometimes I just physically can't go to a protest, right? Or I can't physically show up for a meeting, and that's fine. But I also think if you have the ability to and you're willing to, there's something very beautiful and very intimate about physically showing up in spaces that are devoted to anti-Zionism, that are devoted to Palestinian solidarity, that are devoted to the solidarity between colonized peoples. I think earlier this month, I went to the UHSJP protest for Gaza, and the energy was fire, and we all stood there and we chanted and we listened and we gave each other water and we held signs, and then afterwards we went and we ate food together and we nourished each other. And so I think that like organizing locally and having that level of affirmation physically can be something that's very nourishing and very wonderful, and I would encourage anyone who can to do that, because it is something so beautiful that like I would never give it up for anything. Yeah, that was long too, so I keep long talking, my bad.
That's what we want. We want to hear you talk. That's everything.
Thank you so much, truly, for all of your time and your energy that you put into talking with us and answering questions that, have the potential to bring up a lot of feelings around shitty things that have happened in the last few months and throughout your life. So thank you for being willing to do that and share this space with us, and just give us some of your wisdom. If people want to read any of your work, because I know you're also a writer, or be in touch with you about your work, where is the best place for people to contact you if you would like them to do that?
I think DMs are usually really good. I get a lot of spam, so I ignore some DMs. But if your DM is genuine, I'll answer it on Instagram or on Twitter. That's where I'm most active. I often post details of where to contact me via email, both on Instagram and Twitter. So those are also places you can find me. Yeah, I guess social media is where I'm at usually, especially if I'm, if it's raining and I'm lazy and I'm in bed. So.
And finally, because, we don't make any money and cannot pay you to have this conversation with us. If you're comfortable, if you want to share your Venmo, and if people are listening to this have some money that they can send your way, especially post your firing, we would love if you would drop your Venmo. So hopefully you can get some coins for your knowledge.
Thank you. I think though that I don't know if I necessarily feel comfortable, just because I know the subject matter really heavily relies on Palestine, and I think I don't want to benefit off of talking about something that isn't my struggle. But thank you. I appreciate that a lot.
Yeah, I sort of figured you'd say something like that, but I figured I'd ask. Thank you so much for being here. Yeah, that we're gonna do a little bit of a wrap up, and then for folks who want to listen to this as a podcast or tuned in late, I will make this into a podcast within the next hour, and it will be out that way on Spotify, Apple, Google Podcasts, all of the places. So yeah, to close out, shout out to Nate, who makes our podcast music.
Yeah,
That's
Nate.
Wave. We love and appreciate you. Also just want to highlight, we are taking a break to finish out the Shemitah year. So we will not have any September programming, and you all should maybe take an opportunity to rest as well and rejuvenate yourselves as the Shemitah year asks of us. We do have a really fun October series coming that's going to be a little like book club-esque, so stay tuned so we can all read some really awesome Palestinian literature together. And yeah, just a huge, massive thank you to all of the guests who joined us for our August series. We really hope to do more conversational episodes like this, because it's just been so incredible to get other people's perspectives and listen to all of the incredible wisdom that exists in our community and sort of create these spaces. Thanks, everyone. And thank you so much, Anna.
No, thank you guys for hosting the space and for providing the energy and the zeal and continually investing in anti-Zionist Jewish life. I think it's beautiful what you're doing. I think it's admirable. And I know that you're not paid and that this is done, you know, out of your own passion and your own hobbies and your own free will. And I think that it's something beautiful. And I think a lot of people could learn from what you're doing. And I'm grateful. So thank you for having me.
Thank you so much. Bye, everyone. Bye.
Bye.